Seafarers jailed for 30 years are guilty until proven innocent. Going nuclear? And how about paying an extra $1.5 million to call a port in the US if your ship is built in China? Hi, it's Marcus Hand, editor of Seatrade Maritime News here, with our February news roundup, Maritime in Minutes, and I'm joined as usual by our correspondent, Gary Howard. We will be discussing the shipping news stories that stood out for us over the last month. I really cannot believe we're at the end of February already, even if it is a short month. You're going to be hearing a pretty diverse set of stories from us in this episode, so Gary, why don't you get straight into it?
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. Well, my first story sort of, it sets the pace for February. I was in Qatar when Trump's tariffs on Mexico and Canada were fast approaching. So I spent some time digging in the US Bureau of Transport Statistics data to see what was at stake for the shipping industry. The tariffs were issued by executive order on the 1st of February. This piece was published, I think, on the 3rd of February, and then by the time I woke up on February 4th, it had been announced that the US tariffs on its neighbours had been paused, so it was all a bit of a waste of time. But I learned something anyway, and you're all going to have to learn it with me. Transport by vessel accounted for $121 billion of the $1.5 trillion of trade between the US and Mexico and the US and Canada in 2024, with oil and vehicles accounting for the lion's share. The trade by ship was more significant by weight, with ships carrying 183 million of the 586 million tons of trade between the US and its would-be trade rival neighbours. The full story has more stats on the US trade relationship with its friends in the north and the south, some of which surprised me, such as trucks accounting for 72.3% of the $836 billion of US-Mexico trade and over half of US-Canada trade by value. Talk on the tariff front seems to have died down for now. Well, it hasn't, because I wrote this yesterday, but and then overnight Trump's threatening some new EU tariffs again, so I guess we'll see. You never know how quickly things move at the moment, so yeah, expect some more stories on tariffs in next month's edition.
Actually, did see something like yesterday or the day before that the deadline on these tariffs, which was a month, these are just about to come up, so they could actually come into force in the next few days for all we know.
Time for another look.
Yeah, indeed. I'm going to turn my attention to container shipping and just how much better it was in 2024 than expected. And this was something that was illustrated by the results of AP Moller Maersk. The Danish shipping and logistics company reported its third best ever financial results in 2024, with an EBIT of $6.5 billion, up some 65% on 2023. Now, that actual result was in sharp contrast to the expectations for the year that it published on the 8th of February 2024. Its full-year EBIT forecast for 2024 at that point ranged from a $5 billion loss to break-even, basically zero, warning of a new reality and shipping overcapacity. So what happened? Simply put, the Red Sea crisis and diversions via the Cape of Good Hope. And that was the difference between red ink and one of the best years ever financially for the company. And the same dynamic remains in play for 2025. Based on Maersk's financial forecast for 2025, once container shipping starts going back through the Red Sea, the company starts losing money. Their EBIT forecast for 2025, based on a return to the Red Sea in the mid-year, sees it at break-even for the full year. While, if Cape of Good Hope diversions extend to the end of the year, EBIT is forecast at $3 billion. By implication, that means that in the break-even forecast for the mid-year return to the Red Sea, the first half is profitable and the second half of the year is loss-making. In effect, Red Sea diversions are the only thing keeping Maersk and probably other container lines profitable, and handsomely so. The link to Maersk's results will be in the show notes, but some of this is also based on additional commentary that I post on my LinkedIn feed, so follow me on LinkedIn if you'd like more of that type of content. There aren't too many people called Marcus Hand on there, but I'm not actually the only one, so make sure you follow the journalist, editor, podcaster one. And I'll stop promoting myself now. Gary, you should go on to week 2, and I think you've got more on Qatar.
Yes, February saw the inaugural Seatrade Maritime Qatar event in Doha, and I had the pleasure of visiting Qatar for the first time. met some industry friends from the Middle East and some new faces from Qatar's shipping and logistics sectors. Unsurprisingly, given the sort of lofty ambitions of the Qatar's LNG sector, there are a lot of participants from the offshore market and some great discussions on the challenges facing them there. I wrote up one conference session on the North Field expansion, where panelists spoke about the need for capacity and infrastructure building to support the offshore fleet. Some OSVs are having to leave Qatar for maintenance and repair, as the current facilities are just fully booked. And the OSV fleet there is set to roughly double over the next 5 years or so, and operators are keen to see more local options for servicing and the like. That fleet expansion highlights another issue. OSV operators have a difficult time financing new builds, as day rates have failed to keep up with rising prices at shipyards. Panelists said that the rates being paid by Qatar Energy had risen faster than those they're getting from Saudi Aramco and ADNOC in the region. And the long-term investment strategy in Qatar does support the sector, but there is still a challenge there. The omnipresent issue of availability of seafarers was also raised, as the 100 new OSVs for the North Field expansion will require thousands of trained crew. There's more coverage from Seatrade Maritime Qatar in our events news section on the website, and I think attendees can watch back the full conference programme on the event app if there were any sessions that you missed on the day.
That's a lot of new OSVs and seafarers.
It is, yeah.
Right. And speaking of something that would require trained seafarers, I'm going nuclear for week 2. Now, the idea of commercial ships that would be powered by nuclear energy, fair to say, would have been laughed at a few years ago. But a combination of developments around small modular reactors and the industry's emission targets are rapidly changing that, and it's now on the agenda with leading organizations. One of those clearly backing nuclear propulsion is Classification Society ABS. Chairman and CEO Christopher Wiernicki, speaking at a nuclear summit held by Core Power in Houston, stated, "New nuclear technology is a global decarbonization solution and a commercial shipping disruptor. There is no net zero by 2050 without nuclear." Wiernicki has also stated recently that developments around small modular reactors could help revitalize the US shipbuilding industry. The Classification Society, in addition, has given approval in principle for a 15,000 TEU nuclear-powered container ship designed by HD Korea Shipbuilding and Offshore Engineering. And meanwhile, Gary, later in the month, you reported on a similar development in the UK, where a paper from Lloyd's Register, North Standard and Core Power calls for urgent government action and sets out a policy framework to develop multi-billion-dollar maritime nuclear opportunities. As a bit of a caveat to that, for all the excitement around nuclear power merchant shipping, it is still quite a long way off, and an objection raised to me back in 2009 when the then COSCO chief, Wei Jiafu, promoted the idea at a conference. The objection raised to me was, could you imagine the reaction to a nuclear-powered Chinese container ship sailing into the port of Long Beach? And I think that still rather stands true today.
Yeah, absolutely. I read something yesterday about a company looking at fusion reactors for maritime, so there's always a chance of looking even further into the future for our power sources.
If you're enjoying the Seatrade Maritime podcast, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on the app of your choice.
I'm going to take us over to the IMO, I think. Well, around IMO midterm measures anyway. A hot topic at the moment as MEPC 83 approaches, and the Intersessional Working Group on the Reduction of Greenhouse Gas Emissions from Ships met in February. There was a report out from the UCL Energy Institute, who teamed up with the University of Malawi and Namibia University of Science and Technology. And there was a report that looked at how different market-based measures would impact key commodity trades in coastal state Namibia and landlocked Malawi. The report showed the sort of complexity of the consequences to world trade from the decisions about to be made at IMO. Not only did the trade costs for the chosen commodities vary between commodities, but also over time, depending which of these midterm measures were put into force. Raising funds for decarbonisation initiatives through a greenhouse gas levy has to be balanced with economic stability. The more expensive things get, the less stable economies become. A global fuel standard was generally shown to be more cost efficient in the short term, but had the potential to have higher costs in the long term, while a greenhouse gas levy would have a sort of hard economic impact up front, but prove beneficial over the longer term. And when we're talking short and long term here, we're looking at 2030, 2040 and 2050 as the dates that the report looked into. Each policy framework modelled for the two nations showed higher costs than business as usual, and I recommend following the link to the reports to see just how each approach compares over the next few decades. It was interesting to see just how much things fluctuate.
Yeah, that's an interesting sort of scenario to look at, and I think you're going to come back to the GHG levy later in this episode as well, aren't you, Gary?
Yeah, I think for me it got me beyond that point of just thinking there was a few camps at IMO with different opinions on, how this thing was put into force, and actually there were some real very significant and detailed economic implications for the decisions that are going to be made.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to stay on an issue that the IMO is involved with as well, although there's a lot of other parties involved in this one. It's an issue high on the agenda with shipping organisations, and that is criminalisation and the unfair treatment of seafarers. Now, this is certainly not a new issue, but it would actually appear to be getting worse, and moves are afoot to try and understand the real scale of the issue and formulate international guidelines where the IMO and the ILO are coming in. Meanwhile, though, seafarers continue to suffer grave injustices around the world. One particular case brought to my attention by some friends in the industry, and thank you for doing that, is the case of the bulker Phoenician M, where the master and chief mate have been jailed for 30 years in Turkey for drugs reportedly found on their vessel in October 2023. Seatrade Maritime News correspondent Nick Savidis took a detailed look into the case. It's far too lengthy and involved to give it proper justice in the time we have on here, so I encourage you all to go ahead and read the story headlined, "Seafarers Jailed for 30 Years, Guilty Until Proven Innocent," says the ITF, and the link will be in the show notes. The two officers are appealing their case, but it could take another 2 years for that appeal to be heard, during which time they remain behind bars. There is also a second drugs-related case going on in Turkey involving 12 crew from the bulker Burger Torre. That was in August 2024, and despite a criminal court rejecting an indictment against them due to a lack of evidence linking the drugs to the 12 seafarers, that case remains ongoing. Both cases highlight the arbitrary criminalisation of seafarers and a need for special protection for those who are at the front line of our industry. And Gary, I'm going to pass back to you for the last week of February.
Yeah, my last one for February, I'm going back to the IMO regulations and that intersessional working group on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from ships meeting earlier this month. April is not that far away, and there's little sign of consensus at IMO on how shipping should effectively tax its greenhouse gas emissions, including on whether emissions are calculated on a well-to-wake or a tank-to-wake basis. China and Brazil are among the holdouts supporting this tank-to-wake approach, while the International Chamber of Shipping believes around 3/4 of member states at IMO now support its well-to-wake approach. Despite this disagreement, UCL said it believes that progress is on track for consensus by April's MEPC 83 meeting, and that a greenhouse gas levy in combination with a global fuel standard was the most favoured candidate midterm measure for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from shipping. Details that remain to be hammered out include what the funds generated by a greenhouse gas levy will actually be used for, which seems quite significant. There's another meeting of this working group scheduled for the week before MEPC 83, so if I don't bring this topic up in the next Maritime Minutes, then you can guarantee it will be in the April episode. Over to you for the last one, Marcus.
Yeah, I'm coming to another story that's probably we're going to come back to later as well, actually. I've chosen to bookend this episode with another story related to the Trump administration in the US. And in this case, it's an investigation by the United States Trade Representative, or USTR, that actually started back in early 2024 under the Biden administration, and is now very clearly targeting China's dominant positions in logistics, shipping, and shipbuilding, as that was basically the title of a press release issued the other day. Proposed actions from the USTR would in short make calling US ports in a Chinese-built ship very expensive. The USTR is recommending the imposition of fees on port calls in the States for Chinese-built vessels of up to $1.5 million per entry and Chinese-managed vessels, as well as fees on port calls for vessel operators with ships on order at Chinese shipyards. What would all this actually mean in practice? Well, for a 10,000 TEU container ship, that $1.5 million fee would equate to $150 per TEU or $300 per FEU for each port call in the US, and I do stress that's each port call. Looking at tankers, an $8.3 million cargo from the US Gulf to China today equates to $4.20 per barrel, and that would rise to $4.95 per barrel with that additional port call fee that they're talking about. Reaction from the shipping industry could be summarized as dismay, disbelief, and on social media, are they insane? Jefferies analyst Omar Nokta commented, US port proposal brings another week of disarray. The Global Shippers Council said its US and Canadian members had discussed issues with despair. Now, these are just proposals, and hearings by the USTR are scheduled for 24th of March. There are serious questions to be asked about how such a system would even be workable in practice, or if it's even actually legal. And if it does go ahead, we should probably expect legal challenges, this being the US. One thing is clear though, if you combine a $1 million plus additional port fee with increased tariffs, the real loser in all of this is going to be the US consumer, with increased flight prices and then, therefore, inflation later on as well. And on that note, that's all we have time for in this episode. If you want to learn more about all the stories featured in this episode, links are in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to joining you on the next episode of the Seatrade Maritime Podcast.